Wow. Don't know about you, but I've been spiritually fed, so do we want to go ahead and the love offering, bring the children in? Oh, we could do that. Yeah, we just add more solos in. Sure. I do love that song, and I love how appropriately that song fits in with this theme that we're exploring this Easter season. With this idea of change that each one of us is really looking at and really exploring. This idea of personal transformation that we're all kind of looking at as we explore how we can become more of the Christ nature that we are. And you know, today is one of my favorite days of the whole year. In fact, I consider today to be a national holiday. Now, I know there's a couple of you out there that are sitting there going, what is he talking about? What holiday is it? I know it's the Ides of March. I'm not talking about the Ides of March. Today is Selection Sunday. So there's a few of you out there that got it. Today is the day that we find out what 68 schools are going to be playing for the national championship in college basketball. Yeah. I've worn my KU tie in honor of the day. And you know, tonight I'll be sitting there in front of the TV seeing who gets to go where. And I love that show. And what I love about the show is not seeing the big teams. It's not seeing the Kansas and the Kentuckys and the Dukes make it, because they're so used to making the tournament that you kind of see them, they announce it and they just kind of golf clap for their team. It's the response I get to see from the smaller schools. You know, I think of the schools like the University of California, the Fighting Anteaters. This school, they have not made this tournament in 37 years. Never in their time as Division I school has the University of California at Irvine made this tournament. And they've made it this year. And they're so excited. There's just this glimpses of the brilliance within these kids that's shining out from them. And then that goes on later this week when the actual games start. And you see these kids from these schools that you think they have no chance. There's no way they're ever going to be able to beat these teams. And then everything starts clicking. And they have this glimpse of brilliance, this glimpse of success, and they rise up and they do something that we all thought was impossible. And I love how that relates to each one of us. Because each one of us has in our lives these moments, these glimpses of brilliance, these glimpses of the Christ nature that shine through us. And when they do, when we do these things that we thought were just impossible, things happen in our lives that we never would have thought could have happened before. Now, there's another message in this tournament, and that's that if you look at the history of the NCAA basketball tournament, those glimpses of brilliance, they happen, but very rarely are those the teams that go on and win. It's usually the teams that have been working really hard and practicing and have developed all of this talent that make it all the way through and finally win that championship. And so for us, the work that we have to do is to take those little glimpses of brilliance, those little moments of the Christ light shining from within us, and to begin to transform our lives so that we're living in that place of that Christ light shining in every moment of every day. So that we move just beyond just a glimpse here or there or a little flicker of that divine light that we are into a place where we shine that light constantly. So that we go from that place of being a spiritual underdog to being a spiritual powerhouse. That's what our Easter series is about. That's what this journey to transformation that we're all undertaking over these next few weeks is about. It's about moving us into that place where we are that spiritual powerhouse, where we shine our Christ light in every moment. Now, as I was preparing for today, what I realized is that We have this habit in Unity where we like to throw around these phrases and we just assume everybody knows what we mean when we're talking about it. And Christ is one of those terms. We talk a lot about the Christ light and the nature of the Christ within you, and we just kind of assume that everybody that's sitting out here knows exactly what we mean when we say that. So I thought I wouldn't make that assumption, and I just kind of go back and let's just make sure we all understand what we're talking about when I say we're working to shine our Christ light just a little bit brighter. Now, the two most basic teachings that Unity has are our first two principles. The first one being that God is everywhere present in our world, and that the omnipotent power of God is everywhere present, and that it is always good. And then the second teaching that goes along with that is that there's an element of that God, an element of that divinity that resides within us. That each one of us carries within us this divine spark of God. And we call that divine spark the Christ presence. You see, this idea of Christ, it existed before Jesus. It existed after Jesus. It's the divine quality that's within each of us. It's the quality that Mr. Fillmore wrote about. And when he wrote about it, Charles Fillmore, one of the co-founders of Unity, wrote that it was the element of God that existed within each one of us as our pure potential for perfection. As our pure potential for perfection. And so the work that each one of us is undertaking then is to take that just potentiality, that raw potentiality that exists within each one of us for perfection, and to move into a place where we're living that perfection in every moment of our lives. To move into a place where that Christ light shines in every moment of our lives. Now, I was trying to think of a way to really share this idea with you, this idea of the light that we are. And so I was looking through books, and nothing really kind of stuck for me. There was nothing that really kind of stood out. And I was like, oh yeah, that works. And then it happened, as it so often does. I opened one particular book and saw one line, and there it was. It's happened with so many different books. I've done it with the Bible. I've done it with books by Charles Fillmore. I've done it with books by Dr. Michael Beckwith. And this time it happened to be A Course in Miracles that provided my inspiration for me. So I'd like to share that with you. I opened it up, and I just happened to see this passage. God has lit your mind himself and keeps your mind lit by his light, because his light is what your mind is. God's light is what your mind is. Well, that's so very simple, and yet it seems like if that's what our mind is, why aren't we just always demonstrating that light? Why aren't we just always showing that light? And then I remembered the storm drain that's in front of my house. Now, I promise you, I'm going somewhere with this, so just hold on, because we'll get there. You see, Sarah and I live in a neighborhood that still has a lot of construction going on in it. They're not completely done building all of the houses. And so at all of the storm drains, what the construction workers do is they lay out this plastic tubing that's surrounded by mesh. And the purpose of that tubing is to keep any of the debris from the construction site from going into the storm drain and washing out into the environment. So it catches all of the trash and the stuff that would otherwise just go right into the streams. And then last spring, when it really started raining hard, I noticed something about the drain in front of our house. I noticed it was starting to back up and flood out into the street. And so I went out and looked at it to see what was going on, because, naturally I'm an expert, so I can fix it. And what I saw was there was all this sand, all of this debris that had built up in front of that piece of plastic. And so what was happening was the water couldn't get through because the sand was blocking the way for the water to get through. And I realized that sand is exactly like the beliefs that we build up in our mind about ourselves. You see, that sand blocked the water just as the same way that those beliefs that we hold true about ourselves block that light of God that our mind is from shining through. And so all I had to do was to take a rake or shovel and scrape some of that sand away, and the water began to flow again. And so what we need to do is the same thing. We have a practice that allows us to scrape away and chip away at some of those old beliefs so that that light of God can shine through in a greater way. So that the light of the Christ can shine us through in a greater way. And that's the journey that we're on here today. And it's something that it doesn't always happen and we realize that it's happened in the moment. I think about when we're first beginning these spiritual journeys. Last week we talked about the idea of seeds of truth that get planted within us. And we talked about things that we can do to nurture those seeds, to help them grow, to help them break through the ground, to help them light up our lives with more of that consciousness of God. And so we have these moments where one of those seeds breaks through in a moment and something goes the way we would like to have it go, and we don't always realize what happened. So the work that we need to be doing then is to take those moments and expand them. To take those moments where that glimpse of truth, that glimpse of brilliance shines through, and we expand it so that that glimpse isn't just a glimpse, but it's a light that's always shining. And it seems like those glimpses happen in those moments where we least expect them. Those moments where we say, there's nowhere else for me to go. I have nowhere to turn right now. I have nothing else I can do. I don't know what I'm going to do next. And then the Christ shows up. And it guides us and directs us in what we should be doing and how we should do it. Now, last week, as we talked about nurturing these seeds, we talked about two things you could do to nurture those seeds of growth within you, to nurture the seeds of transformation. We talked about this idea of loving God with all your heart, of entering into a spiritual practice where you really engage in ideas of God and you wrestle with those ideas and you determine what works for you. And we also talked about this idea of forgiveness, of moving through your life forgiving those whom you've judged to be less of that Christ presence than you are. And we talked about how doing any of those two things will begin to nurture those seeds of transformation so that they break through within you in a different way, and you begin to see more of that light shining within you. And I know there are a few of you out there that have experienced more of that light. You've told me that you've entered into these practices and that this light is showing up in you in a different way. I know there's a few of you who have also found success with it because you came up and you were cursing me for the experience you had in this past week. Those are the ones that were doing the forgiveness work. But it doesn't really matter which of those two practices you chose to engage in, because the important piece is that your light continued to grow. That light that you are began to show up in a different way. And you began to recognize that it was there to begin with. And so now it's time for the next phase of our journey. You see, now we have to take that light and we want to expand it. We want to grow so that that light is all that we are. And it has a lot to do with our spiritual journey. When I first started out on this spiritual journey, I had this idea. And it was this idea that I was starting right here, that this was point A. And I began working on my journey and studying spiritual things and paying attention to God, and I would begin moving in this direction. And then all of a sudden it seemed like that voice of God stopped talking. It seemed like I stopped feeling that inspiration and that guidance. And I started to wonder why. Because I'm doing everything I should be doing. I'm still praying. I'm still meditating. And then I realized my spiritual journey, at least, isn't a linear journey. It's not a journey from a point A to a point B. It's not a journey across a level plane. It's a journey up. It's a journey about ascending in my consciousness. It's a journey about growing in my awareness of that consciousness of God that's within me. In fact, I like to think of that journey like a staircase. Because what I've experienced in my life is that as I've moved up that staircase and as I've grown in my understanding of God's working in my life, I reach these different plateaus, these different levels of understanding as I ascend my consciousness. It's almost like, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Ghostbusters. But you'll remember at the end of Ghostbusters, when they're going up to the top of the building and they're climbing that staircase and they're making their way, and they finally get to this one, they're all kind of huddled over like this, and they're breathing heavily, and they're wondering if there's an elevator. Our spiritual journey is kind of that way. You see, we're moving up that staircase, and sometimes that influx of spirit starts coming so quickly, and it's so powerful in our life that we just kind of go, whoa, I need to rest. And so God gives us time to rest. Or sometimes things are just going so well that we're happy where we're at. We're happy on that step. And so we choose to just stay there for a time being, and God gives us time to just stay there. But the truth of the matter is, that brilliance of God is so far greater than that experience that we've had. That light of God shines in an even greater way. And that light of God calls us higher. It calls us forward. And then we get to this point where we can't contain it anymore, and we have to take that next step. We have to continue walking up that staircase and move into a greater understanding of that power and presence of God. So how do we do that? Well, the most simple way for us to do that is through prayer, through divine communication with God. And I want us to begin thinking of prayer in that way, that prayer is this idea of this divine communication with God. You know, I think so often if we spend our time looking at prayer and thinking of prayer as this sort of beseeching, begging from God to give what we would like in an experience. And certainly there's nothing wrong with that kind of prayer. There's a time and a place for prayer like that. There's certainly times where I've needed that prayer, that dear God, please help me make it through this experience. That's a perfectly valid form of prayer. But if we're limiting ourselves to only that type of prayer, well, then we've done ourselves a great disservice in experiencing the allness that God is. And there are so many ways for us to pray. There's so many ways to enter into that divine conversation with the element of God that you are. And so if you'd like to explore more of those ways, if you'd like to explore how to connect with that presence of God, we have a class coming up. And it's called How to Pray to God, or How to Pray with God Without Really Talking, or something to that effect, right, Rosie? Rosie's the facilitator of that class, and she'll be guiding you through all of those different ways to pray. There are so many different ways to pray that I thought it would be best to just pick one for us to focus on here today. One method of prayer that we can really begin to explore in this coming week to grow those glimpses of brilliance into the true brilliance that each of us is. And so to introduce that method of prayer, I'd like to actually tell us a story. And it's a story that comes from the Gospel of John. And many of you might actually know the story of Lazarus, who Jesus raised from the dead. And if you're not familiar with this story, Lazarus was a gentleman. He became sick. And so his friends and his family said, well, there's a healer. His name's Jesus. And if you send for Jesus, he'll come and he'll heal Lazarus. Well, Jesus didn't make it in time. In fact, Jesus was about 4 days late arriving to this family. And when he got there, Lazarus had died 4 days earlier, and the family said, no, you're wasting your time. It's too late. He's already gone. And then Jesus spoke to the family, and he said the following. He said, take away the stone. And they kind of questioned him, and Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? And so they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe you sent me. And when he said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet bound with strips of cloth, his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Now, this story is filled with symbolism. It's also filled with foreshadowing for the crucifixion and the resurrection that's coming up later on in the chapter. But what I want us to really focus on today is the prayer. It's the prayer that Jesus says before he calls Lazarus out. You see, Jesus doesn't walk out in front of the tomb and say, "Dear God, please let Lazarus come back to us." He doesn't stand there and go, "God, if you let Lazarus come back, I'll be a better Jesus." He's not pleading, he's not begging. He starts his prayer by saying, "Thank you, God, for hearing me. Thank you, God, for hearing me." He comes from that place of gratitude, that place of knowing that his prayer is already answered. You know, I want to challenge us in the way that we think about this idea of thanksgiving. Because so often when we think about being thankful for things, what we do is we enter into this intellectual practice of being thankful. We list our gratitudes, we write them out, we may even have a gratitude journal, and we keep track of things in there. And those are valuable practices to have. We use them with the children in YFM occasionally. We encourage them to write lists about things that they're grateful for. Like I said, they're valid practices to have because they remind us of all of the blessings that we have in our life. But there's so much more to praying a prayer of gratitude, to really moving into that feeling of being grateful. You know, I can go through a traffic light and make it just in time, so I just make that green light. And as I go through, I can say, "Thank you, God." And that serves a purpose. But there's so much more to it when I close my eyes at night and I connect with that power and presence of God within me. And I say, "Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God." Wouldn't you say that with me together? Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. You see, feeling it makes all the difference. Really feeling into that place of gratitude makes such a difference. And if we're not quite ready to feel grateful for something, we can begin with the intention. We can begin with the list setting. Because those things help us move into a place where we can feel gratitude. They help us move into that place where we can remember how we've been blessed. We can remember the resources that we have right now. Because the spiritual truth is that the things that we're grateful for multiply. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that's experienced this. I'm sure I'm not the only one that has noticed when I go through life, if I'm more grateful, things go better. If I go through life and I'm grateful for things are just kind of better in my world and in the world around me. Am I the only one that has that experience? Yeah, so I knew I wasn't. I knew there were others. In fact, I started looking to see what I could find out in the world, and I found an article that I thought was very interesting. Now, I know there are several of you out there that have just been dying to hear me say I was looking at the New York Times science page, and yeah. And I found an article. You're going to have to keep waiting. This didn't come from the New York Times. This was a press release from the University of California at Berkeley. And it reads, "Scientists at Greater Good Science Center at the University of California, Berkeley, in collaboration with the University of California, Davis, have launched a $5.6 million three-year project expanding the science and practice of gratitude. The general goals of this initiative are to expand the scientific database of gratitude, particularly in the key areas of human health, personal and relational well-being, and developmental science. To promote evidence-based practices of gratitude in medical, educational, and organizational settings and in schools, workplaces, homes, and communities, and in so doing, engage the public in a larger cultural conversation about the role of gratitude in civil society. Now, if you don't know a lot about how these studies get put together, they don't just give you $5.6 million to just explore what it's like if we say thank you to people. You have to state your reasons. You have to have some sort of rationale for your study. And so this was the rationale that the Greater Good Science Center put forward. And said, recently scientists have begun to chart a course of research aimed at understanding gratitude and the circumstances in which it flourishes or diminishes. They're finding that people who practice gratitude consistently report a host of benefits: stronger immune systems and lower blood pressure, higher levels of positive emotions, more joy, optimism, and happiness, acting with more generosity and compassion, and feeling less lonely and isolated. So all of these things have started to show up because people were expressing gratitude. And what I would say, the argument that I would make to that, is that yes, the gratitude was important, but all it really is an indication of the truth that these people have begun to express more of their Christ selves. That the gratitude is the vehicle for what they're experiencing, not the cause itself. That the cause itself is that Christ light that has begun to shine through them in a greater way. And ultimately, that's what we're all about here as we move towards Easter, is learning how each one of us can shine our Christ lights in a greater way. And learning how each one of us can use that Christ light that we are to get that mental house that we have in order, to move into that place of understanding from within us. That's what this journey is about. And so I've got homework for you this week. I know, yay, homework, yay. This week, I want you to spend time each day. I want you to enter into a daily practice of gratitude. You know, our other co-founder, Myrtle Fillmore, when Unity began as a ministry, she began writing letters out to many people. They'd write prayer letters in, and Myrtle would respond with letters. And in one of her letters, she wrote, "If you have never practiced daily thanksgiving in your home, you have left unused one of the most potent factors available to you for bringing about ideal conditions in your household." One of the most potent factors available to you. And so I'm going to encourage you to enter into that daily practice of gratitude, to enter into that practice of truly being grateful for everything that you see, to practice that feeling of being grateful for God's light as it shines as you. Because we've begun to experience these little glimpses of brilliance. And now it's time for us to take our gratitude and make those glimpses shine even brighter in our lives. God bless you.